Welcome back to Beauty Unfiltered. I'm your host, Jocelyn Dias. On today's episode, we will be talking about the concept of Skinimalism and its appearance in commercials. Skinimalism takes a less is more approach in terms of skincare that addresses skin impurities at the source rather than trying to cover them up with makeup products and any other products. Many people have caught on to this idea as it was highlighted in the previous episode of Beauty Unfiltered as one of the top beauty trends of 2023 by Cult Beauty. Skinimalism is viewed as a positive shift in beauty standards, as it does not require as many modifications to achieve a higher level of beauty. However, it still involves the use of moisturizers, face washes, and even wrinkle cream to be purchased in order to achieve these goals, promising viewers if they buy certain products, they can have blemish-free skin. A recent Neutrogena ad starring Jenna Ortega and Jennifer Garner achieves this goal in just 15 seconds. The ad begins with Garner asking what the right age is to start using Neutrogena retinol. Ortega responds with, "Whenever you want it to be." While this appears to promote beauty for all ages and bridge that gap between generations when talking about beauty, the underlying theme is to expand the product's audience to Gen Z, which has just begun earning their own income in the workforce. Neutrogena retinol is a wrinkle cream targeting wrinkles, although that's not directly discussed in the commercial. The ad uses the words smoothing fine lines and evening skin tones in order to attract Gen Z and adhere to Skinimalism's values of targeting impurities at the source, while encouraging girls to combat wrinkles before they even form. This ad, in addition to the advertisement for CoverGirl's Simply Ageless foundation, enhanced the idea that beauty is youth. The ad stars Nikki Taylor, who was one of the cover girls for the brand's magazines in the 90s. Taylor is promoting foundation that helps her look as young as she did nearly 30 years ago, referring to it as America's #1 anti-aging foundation. On the surface, the ad attempts to once again bridge that gap between generations, but it really just focuses the idea that women need to look young and give them that youthful glow. According to Vogue India, looking youthful while using fewer, well-formulated products is the appeal of Skinimalism, because it saves time and uses only the best products for the skin. Advertisements intentionally pick elements they know will encourage women to buy their products, including the ability to challenge female stereotypes, and even the tense of words used within the ad. A study by Axtam et al. In 2017 determined that female empowerment advertising, which is advertising that questions female stereotypes, increased ad and brand attitudes and loyalty among the female audience. It also lowered ad reactance, which is a feeling of negative arousal when one's feeling of freedom is threatened. Stereotypical portrayals of women were found to be damaging to women's self-esteem levels and levels of reactance. Female empowerment advertising, also known as femvertising, lowered the reactance, which encouraged them to consider buying the products and be more likely to make those purchases. Another study on beauty cream advertisements in Pakistan by Siddiqui et al. Also examined the importance of focusing on the mind of women when persuading them to purchase products. Using Fairclough's model, it was found that lingual elements, including using the second-person pronouns, as well as future tenses to describe actions of the audience to persuade them to buy a product. The ad with Nikki Taylor says, "Come into your fresh face from home," appealing to second-person pronouns to engage with viewers and to make them feel more connected with the product and that the product will have a direct benefit for them personally. The word fresh, as described in Siddiqui's study, is a positive adjective that describes what the product will do for people's skin and who will use the product. Here to talk more about Skinimalism's impact in advertising is Professor, Co-Chair, and Director of the Undergraduate Program in Psychology, Dr. Mala Madison. Yay!
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me, Jocelyn.
Of course. Thank you so much for joining me. So, are you familiar with the concept of Skinimalism?
Until you introduced me to it, I actually wasn't. So thanks for that introduction to it.
Of course. I actually hadn't heard of it either until I started doing my research about advertising for this episode. It was definitely a new thing that I discovered based off of what we've done in the preliminary part. How do you feel about Skinimalism?
So here's my understanding of what Skinimalism is, and correct me if I'm wrong. This idea that one can, and I would say women particularly, can create an image of themselves by using certain products that makes it look like they're really not doing very much, right? It's sort of this natural look. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a natural look versus the older trends that usually involve more makeup, more products, more of everything. This is kind of, like you said, looking to use less product. And a lot of the times they do try to use less product, but it's always what they're selling too. So it's the tricky thing with the advertising portion of it. Messages about female bodies have become more hidden in ads, and that kind of goes along with Skinimalism. They're trying to disguise it as, oh, if you use this one product, then that'll be good enough, rather than older ads that are more clear in their intent, that kind of say right out that you need to use all these products and do all these things. What impact do these subliminal messages have versus the more direct ones?
Yeah, it's interesting because it isn't so direct. One, I think people are smarter. I think people are getting smarter about messaging and quote unquote being hit over the head by something isn't really working. And so this idea that one can kind of infer beauty standards, but in this more subtle way is sort of interesting. But I know we'll talk a little bit more about how that's sort of promoted in advertising, which is another interesting connection to that.
For sure. Do you think it's better or worse to kind of have that clear, direct statement? You said people are getting smarter. Do you think...
I do think people are getting smarter. I remember when there was that, it was years ago, but when the Dove campaign came out, right? I mean, everybody was like, this is so great. And in some ways, I think that Skinimalism is sort of following up on that idea that all bodies, that your quote unquote natural self is beautiful. So I sort of see it in that vein. But there was an advertisement that showed this woman on a billboard, but it went back and showed how she was made up, right? What she started with and how she became that. And I think people are smart in that way, understanding that those images are created images, that they're not natural. There's a lot going on in terms of photoshopping someone's face and body. And so I think in that way, people are smarter. So this idea that your natural beauty will shine through with this idea of Skinimalism is interesting, but I also feel like it's it can be harmful in a way that suggests if you're not quote unquote naturally beautiful, then there's something wrong with you. And I think that is an interesting notion.
Yeah, that is an interesting notion. You had said, showing the process of beauty and everything and showing how it's not natural. You said a lot of great things. I want to touch on all of them. But that reminded me about how influencers are doing more get ready with me now and showing all the products that they use and showing their whole process and all of these products that they use. So in a way, that is a really good point, showing that it's not natural and it's still feeding into the advertising aspect too, because they're advertising certain products that they use. They're showing the bottles with the brand names and everything going from their whole routine. And then the last thing you mentioned is also very interesting. Can you elaborate a little more?
Oh, about the harm?
Yeah, about the harm that it's had.
So here's what I think about. I see, look, advertising is about selling a product. Bottom line, companies want to sell their product and make money. And one of the things that years ago really struck me and has always continually struck me is this idea that there's something beneficial about products and ads and companies that make money off of the insecurities of women. And so if you don't feel beautiful and if you don't feel as if you are, quote unquote, the Skinimalism idea, if you are not beautiful enough naturally, then you are going to seek out the product that will help you to look that way. And so this idea that there's something that this product can give you is really a selling point, and I think differentiates these kinds of products from other products. I mean, the other thing is the market is flooded with products. I mean, I go to the store and it's just like, it's aisles and aisles of product. So how does one pick the one, right, to spend their money on? And I think in some ways, advertisers and those people who are influencers who promote those products are trying to differentiate themselves from all the other things on the shelves. And so this sort of, I would call it a new-ish idea, and it is sort of a lovely idea that you're just beautiful as you are and you don't need any products, but in fact, you do.
Right. Unfortunately, you always do need something. A moisturizer, a wrinkle cream. There's always something. That's such a good point about going to the store. Actually, I don't wear makeup very often, but I went yesterday to get some new makeup, and I was like, I don't even know where to begin. There's just, like you said, aisles and aisles of it. Influencers now making their own statements about it, and there is just so many options now for all of that. So even with Skinimalism using less is more, I mean, it's still more at the same time.
That's a good point. It still is more, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's effort more subliminal more, I guess you could say. In your time teaching, have you noticed an impact and kind of a switch between these beauty standards with students that come through your class and conversations that you have?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Thanks for asking about teaching because, I've been teaching a course here at the university that started, oh my goodness, over 20 years ago, and the course was called Women, Weight, and Worry. And then another course that became similar to that before, just for first-year students, beauty, body image, and feminism, this idea between, how we take sort of feminist ways of thinking, ways we think about women, and that connection to these beauty standards. And what I have noticed, and I used to actually show that one video that I referred to earlier, the Dove one where it shows the process of the photoshopping. I remember at some point that was absolutely profound, that people were like, oh, you mean these ads that we look at are created and that woman actually doesn't look that way? It was very profound. That is no longer profound. And when I mentioned earlier about people getting smarter, yeah, I think people are getting smarter and they do realize that. And so, lately my conversations with students have been around acknowledging that, like, that's sort of now a given, that people know this happens. But reconnecting with makeup in a way that is positive and fun and creative, so that it doesn't have this sort of, oh, if you use too much makeup, you're sort of put in a particular category, that there has been lately this idea that of choice, about wearing it, not wearing it, and not having really so much of a reflection on who you are as a person. And I would also say that more and more students are identifying in different ways around their gender. So even using the word woman, right, has a certain connotation to it around beauty, and that there is this really interesting navigation around trans and non-binary students who have a very different relationship with makeup when they use it, when they don't use it, and the meaning that has for them. And that's actually just been really something very helpful to me in thinking in really broader ways about people's identities.
That's a really good point about gender, actually, because, women are the ones that are expected to wear makeup. Women that identify as women, we're born as women. That is the demographic that is typically supposed to wear makeup. But even people that identify as non-binary even men that identify as male do wear makeup. Everybody has that choice to wear makeup and should be able to embrace that. So that's a really good point. There's almost that stigma because you don't really see any male makeup influencers in advertising, even though there are plenty of them on YouTube. The first one I think of is James Charles. His platform, he's very masculine but also very feminine, and that could definitely be something to see in the future. More male makeup influencers get some spotlight because it is still all female identifying people that are shown in these advertisements.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And there are actually, I don't use social media a lot, but there are certain accounts that I do follow because I do find them really interesting. And yeah, I have noticed that. And they tend to be at least the people who are trans or non-binary, in terms of watching them, in terms of what they do with makeup, is that it is useful and it is used by them. So that's a new way for me to look at it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many talented makeup artists. People do insane designs of the eyeshadow and all of that, and I feel like there should be more representation of everybody that has that gift and talent that can really do that with makeup.
Right.
So gender, again, is a really, really good point on that. And you were talking about that video with the photoshopping process. I don't know if we watched that exact one when I was in Beauty, Body, Image, and Feminism, but it sounds very familiar. And I was thinking, I remember we also talked about the magazine cover and how it actually took elements from 7 different women to make one cover girl or one on the magazine. And that I thought was insane.
Yeah. Right. It still happens. It's just normal, right? So we are actually looking at people in magazines on our social media accounts that literally don't exist. I know that people talk a lot about AI, in terms of AI generated text, but also images. And in some ways, advertisers have been doing this a long time around the beauty standards and beauty images. We have literally been generating people who don't exist. And then when women or people don't feel I can't actually fit that standard or I'll never look like that. Well, you know what? That person that you're looking at, they don't even look like that.
Right. They don't even fit the standard of what
even fit it. Right. And there's been some really interesting quotes from people who, from models who have said such kind of things. I would like to look like that image of quote unquote me because it's actually not me.
Right, exactly. I've seen the same things. I was actually thinking about that when we were talking. They're like, oh, that's not even me, and that's me. So how are you supposed to look like that if I don't even look like myself? But that's the thing that's really interesting. We know it's all out on the table. We know this is happening. Yet we all, or not we all, but a lot of people still feel inadequate even though we know it. Why does that happen? Why do we still feel inadequate even though we know?
That is such a good and big question, right? One, I think what you're pointing to is those images matter. Jocelyn, if those images didn't matter and they weren't important, you know what? Advertisers would quit spending the billions of dollars that they spend in creating them. The companies who create such a product would also just figure out a different way of what they were going to sell. For instance, the Skinimalism idea that you need very little. I think that's just sort of this next wave of, how can we actually make more money? And how can we make people, particularly women, feel like they are not fitting this standard, that they are not beautiful, and that they are not enough? And here's one way that you can do that, right? So until those images stop being as powerful as they are, because I think they get us on a gut level, on a heart level, on a emotional level, where we can talk about it. I mean, I talk about this with you and with other people all the time. And intellectually, there's a knowing. And yet, those images get to us on a very different level than our intellect, right? That doesn't go through our intellect all the time.
Absolutely. That, I think you summarized it perfectly, saying that it's important, and you're absolutely right. And that kind of leads to the idea that this advertising cycle is just going to continue, because if that stops being important, they're going to find what else is important. So advertising is in a good momentum right now of feeding off of people's insecurities, which is unfortunate. And they're always going to find a way to do that with AI and beauty standards and finding what is important to people at some gut level. Because I do the same thing. I have these conversations partially because I do the same things and I try to learn more about it. And it's hard. It is, because there's always going to be something that they're going to feed off of that somebody's insecure about. And it's really unfortunate.
Right, right. And we tend to, I think about the ways that we compliment each other and ways we compliment little girls as opposed to how we do that with little boys and what things we say, right? And it's very, very common. And there's some very classic studies that show this, like when a baby is dressed up in pink, as I am wearing today, that we say things to this baby like, oh, you're so beautiful, you're so delicate. We say these kinds of things. And you can take the same infant and dress that infant in what is traditionally seen as boy clothes in blue. And you will get people like taking their arms and going, oh, you have such a strong little muscle. You're going to be so strong. So our messaging just early on and continues to be, that's what we say to people. And they're compliments, and they're meant as compliments. But I'm hopeful, and I try really hard to think about ways and what I can say to people to compliment them that are not body related, that are not beauty related, and that has things to do with your intelligence and how you're contributing to the world and other kinds of things that we can say to people that is not really related to their bodies.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. I feel like there's been some experiment done where they dress a baby in the different colors, like same baby, but just putting different clothing on and seeing people's reaction and how different it is, even though it's the same child.
Yeah.
I feel like people also have a hard time because, yes, as people get older, there are many things they contribute in their interests. But what do you say to a little baby in a stroller? They haven't really matured enough to do anything, to have interests yet. So people do automatically go to the physical traits because that's what they see in front of them. There's not a lot of room with babies either. So that's a really hard thing to combat. Definitely as people get older, there's a lot of things you can compliment them on. But as a baby, they're not as developed yet. They don't have as many intellectual strengths yet.
Right.
So
right.
how do we even approach that with babies?
I'm going to answer that question by sharing this. Well, for me, it is now a sort of a classic essay that was written in 1972, and it came out in Ms. Magazine, and it was called Baby X, and it was actually about a couple who had a baby, and they named the baby X. And, and you could make the argument about X and Y and chromosomes and what that means. But they called the baby X. And as the baby grew up, it dressed in overalls. And baby X had a lot of different kinds of toys. They had dolls, but they also had trucks. And it's a really interesting story that talks about people's reactions to not knowing someone's gender. Not knowing this baby's gender, and people getting really angry at the parents, like, well, why won't you say whether this is a boy or a girl? But it points out, like, when the child starts to go to school and they have the line for the girls and they have the line for the boys, right? To line up to go into your class. And they have the boys' restroom and the girls' restroom. And they're like, what happens to baby X? Where do they stand in line? And it's a great essay because it points out how many structural kinds of ways that we just gender people automatically. And so to get at this ungendering or just making, things available to everyone, for me is a really interesting exercise because it points out the ways that we are just so trained in different ways to think about that.
For sure. When you were talking about the restrooms, I actually just remembered my elementary school restroom. The girls' was pink. It was pink and yellow, the whole thing. And I never went in the male restroom, but like just from the door opening and passing, it was all blue and gray and black. And just that color connotation in grades, kindergarten through fourth grade restrooms, they already had those colors right there for you. They already had it so gendered, and I mean, there's definitely reason to have the separate restrooms, but why the color scheme? Why can't we have the same colored restrooms? And they would say, because that would confuse the kids, but at the same time, why does it have to be so segregated at such an early age? That's really tricky. Like,
Well, even color is changed in the United States. And I only know this from a historian who talked about how, we associate blue with boys, but it was not that way in the early 1900s. I mean, pink was the color of boys, right? So historically, that switched. And, so one, color is just a color, and what we attach it to is the meaning that we make from it. But I remember being in a class once, I was teaching Introduction to Gender Studies and talking about this, and there was a student from China who raised their hand and said, those even are not the colors we associate with males and females. So color is also cultural, and the colors that were associated with different things have different meaning. Like in the United States around death, right? When we go to a funeral or someone has died, we tend to wear dark colors and black. That's not true everywhere. So I think we just have to understand that all of these things, gender and color, and that is really part of a larger structure and part of a larger meaning given where we live.
absolutely. That's a really good point that it is cultural. I was thinking of like peacocks, how the males are the ones with the color and the females are the ones without the colors. People in America typically would think, I personally thought that the female peacocks were the colorful ones, and it ended up being the opposite because I have been so trained to think that way, and I feel like a lot of people would do the same thing. And yeah, really, colors are colors, and that's really interesting how they've switched over time throughout history. Like you said, pink was a masculine color. If you said that to anybody today, they wouldn't believe it because they're like, no, that's a girl color, obviously.
Right.
But,
so just a shout out to our historians, right?
Yes.
Important to know the history of such things.
Absolutely.
And I just want to, I want to say thank you, and I appreciate your introducing me to this new term and giving me an opportunity for us to talk about it.
Of course, yeah. It was a new topic for me too. I knew advertising was where the episode was going, but I wasn't sure what about it. Like there was something missing. But this concept that really seems to advance everything, but it's really still just going through all the motions with having all of these standards and everything. And the clear skin is a big one for Skinimalism. And I feel like that's where like my generation is kind of caught in with that, and why there's so many acne regimens, and why people, when they say, oh, helps with acne, people buy it immediately. And just almost the tense of the words that they use like on the bottles and in the ads also really helps create that revenue. People love to hear the second person like, this is going to help you directly with these problems, and they know the problems to target. And right now with my generation at least, it's definitely like acne and blemishes, and yeah, I mean, really, it's blemishes on the face is what it is right now.
Right.
They want like completely clear skin all the time.
Right. So I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about images in my own head. And the other thing about advertising is that, and this has changed over time, but beauty's also been equated with whiteness. Right? So even when I look at ads, and thankfully there are more people of color in ads. And I know that there are now some makeup lines, this is very, very recent, that look at different skin tones, right? And are providing makeup that actually matches different skin tones. But for a long, long time, really, it was a really white skin palette that women of color had an option for. So part of beauty is also really, it's not only gendered, but it's also racialized.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm thinking Rihanna's newest line as a woman of color with darker skin. She released her makeup line to help people with a different colored skin, different textured skin, because not all skin reacts to makeup the same way, too. So it's race, not only the color, but also the skin reacts to the makeup differently and in ways that I am unaware of because I am white, but I do need to learn more about how, like, different skin, different hair. We don't talk about that. We talk about white skin, white hair, like the white culture that I'm used to, and we definitely need to have more conversations about how makeup works with different skin tones, different skin types, and everything like that. And it is definitely starting to become a thing more in advertising, which I'm really glad to see. And even with Dove, they've had different models of different skin tones and that kind of thing. So we definitely need to keep going in that direction, get makeup
agree.
more inclusive for everybody. Because everyone, even though we don't need it, and that's the whole point of this, nobody needs the makeup. Everyone who wants to wear it and uses that to help them feel beautiful should have the opportunity to do so in a way that is comfortable.
Absolutely. Thank you. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. I really enjoyed it, and I've loved watching you grow and connected with you throughout the years. And happy graduation.
Oh, thank you. I've absolutely loved having you for Beauty, Body, Image, and Feminism, and I'm so thankful that you decided to keep me around in your back pocket of people to stay connected with, and through Women for Change as well. I'm so happy to be able to have conversations like this with a faculty member, because that's not a very typical occurrence anywhere, so I'm really thankful that we have this relationship. Thank you so much for tuning in. Join me next week as I talk to Noreen Fasulo, adjunct professor and UHeart alumna, about the portrayal of female bodies in television and film.